In this series of videos I'm doing in preview of Chris Eubank Jr. vs Conor Benn, I've looked at a lot of the similarities with their fathers Chris Eubank Sr. and Nigel Benn's respective lives both in and out of the ring. For instance, in the ring, Nigel Benn and Chris Sr. had both permanently damaged an opponent and left them disabled, two fights that I've discussed at length in this series. And when it comes to what else Nigel and Chris Sr. have in common in the ring, an obvious one would be common opponents, as the two rivals of course fought in the same weight classes during the same era. So common opponents aren't some crazy, eerie or coincidental similarities when it comes to comparing the two men's careers outside of their fights with each other. Benn and Eubank had both fought Winston Burnett, Anthony Logan, Michael Watson, Kid Milo, Dan Sherry, Sugarboy Malinga and Henry Wharton. So a lot of common opponents there. But there's one common opponent who the legendary Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn had both fought twice, and they both lost to that common opponent twice, that being none other than the Celtic warrior Steve Collins. So today we take a brief look back at Steve Collins' two fights against Chris Eubank and his two fights against Nigel Benn. So the first fight of the four, Chris Eubank vs Steve Collins 1, is probably the most storied of the bunch. The fight took place on March 18th, 1995 at the Green Glens Arena in Mill Street in Steve Collins' home country of Ireland. Oh, and by the way, this was St. Patrick's Day weekend. And Collins was challenging Eubank for Eubank's WBO super middleweight title. This fight was part of the active defending champion Chris Eubank's 8-fight deal with Sky Sports that he signed in the summer of '94. The deal that got Barry Hearn's Matchroom Sport on Sky, which I've discussed already in this series. This deal came just after Eubank's split decision victory over Ray Close in their second fight against each other in May of '94. A fight which then left Eubank with one draw with Ray Close and one split win over him. So two close fights with Close. So Eubank's first fight of the 8-fight deal was against Mauricio Amaral in July of '94. Eubank won this fight by unanimous decision. And fast forward to the end of 1994, Eubank had already completed and won 4 of the 8 fights of the deal, and then had 14 total defences of his WBO super middleweight strap. Now Eubank's first title defence in 1995 was set to be a trilogy fight with Ray Close in February at the King's Hall in Belfast, Ray's hometown and the same location of their second fight with each other. However, Ray Close unfortunately failed a routine brain scan as 2 lesions were found on his brain, so his British Boxing Board of Control licence was revoked. Eubank now needed a new opponent, and a presser was held to announce Ray Close's retirement from boxing. However, this presser was also held to introduce Chris Eubank's new opponent. So one Steve Collins then stepped into Ray Close's seat. The Irishman had stepped in to replace the Northern Irishman, and Chris Eubank vs Steve Collins was then set for March. So Chris Eubank was the reigning and defending undefeated WBO super middleweight champion with a record of 41-0 with 2 draws. And the 28-3 Steve Collins was actually the WBO middleweight champion, having just won that belt off of Chris Pyatt. And Collins' 3 losses included a decision loss to Mike McCallum in challenging for McCallum's world title quite early in his career, a competitive decision loss to Reggie Johnson in a vacant world title fight, and a split decision loss in challenging for Sumbu Kalambe's European title. So no shame in those losses. Although Eubank was the favourite and the big star, and Collins was moving up to Eubank's weight class to challenge for his title, it is fair to say that Steve Collins was a step up from Eubank's other challengers. But the tale of the tape doesn't quite end there. So there was of course Steve Collins' mind games, and it started out at the launch press conference in Ireland, in which Steve Collins showed up late and started out by exclusively speaking in Gaelic, the native Irish tongue that Eubank of course couldn't understand. And then when Steve Collins started to speak English, he began to question Eubank's cultural identity, questioning why he denies his African heritage and portrays himself as an Englishman when he's not English. Eubank would later go on to admit that these press conference antics from Collins successfully got into his head. Eubank was so livid at the time that when the Lord Mayor asked him if he wanted a tour around the city, Eubank responded, "Fuck this city," which is very impactful in regards to how rattled he was, as Christopher Livingston Eubank is of course a very well spoken man who doesn't condone in the use of profanity, and I tend to refrain from using profanity myself, but I had to add it in there to capture the shock factor of Eubank using such language. That was not very parliamentary procedure from Eubank, one might say. But as many of you may know, the mind game from Steve Collins was turned up a notch with that famous hypnosis ordeal. Of course, Steve Collins going public with the fact that he was being hypnotised by Tony Quinn was a way to get the mental upper hand on Eubank, which did work. But this started out from an initial negative that the underdog in Steve Collins managed to turn into a positive. Steve Collins' trainer of the time was Freddie King, who also trained Herbie Hyde, and the English Herbie Hyde was scheduled to defend his WBO heavyweight title against Riddick Bowe in Vegas a week before Collins was fighting Eubank. So Freddie King was therefore occupied with Herbie Hyde, and Collins was essentially on his own for the training camp. So despite the hypnotist Tony Quinn not being equipped to train a world championship boxer at all, Collins did go to Quinn for genuine help to get him in the right mind frame. But it was weigh-in day, the day before the fight, when Steve Collins had told Eubank how he had prepared for this fight, through the hypnosis. And one of the most interesting, peculiar, and some would even say hilarious boxing stories of all time was then born. Chris Eubank was absolutely spooked by the fact that Steve Collins was hypnotised. It had completely broke his stoicism. Eubank thought that Collins was doing black magic and he didn't want to go ahead with the fight. And Eubank's trainer Ronnie Davis and his promoter Barry Hearn sat up until 1 AM the night before the fight, convincing Eubank to actually go ahead with the fight. Then there was that famous interview on fight day in which Eubank was talking about how if he had it his way then the fight wouldn't be going ahead, and he was just going on about how afraid he was essentially.
I wanted to call the fight off. That's why I would call the fight off if I could now, because I'm going into unknown territory. The 43 fights I've had in the past, I've always known what I was dealing with. I don't know what I'm dealing with tonight. I'm fighting someone who's mechanically orientated, and that is just an unknown area. It's not fair that I should be put into this situation. Is there any such thing as hypnotism? Yes, there is. You know, and if I pull out the fight now, then I lose credibility, is what I'm told by my manager Barry Hearn. But if I had my way, I'd walk away from this fight, and that's not being coward. That's being sensible.
And the mind games continued up until the fight was just about to commence, as Collins sat in his corner with his hood up and headphones in until the referee called them to fight, and he had Tony Quinn by his side in the ring. As for the actual fight now, cagey start, but we could tell from the off that the Mill Street crowd were well into it. The first significant moment of the fight was Eubank arguably being robbed of a knockdown after landing a right hand early in round 2 that sent Collins to the canvas, but the referee ruled it a slip, and not much was made of it at the time. For the rest of that round and in the preceding rounds, it was a competitive affair with a few tight rounds, but Collins was outworking Eubank for the most part, beating Eubank to the punch when they got in range, and being first and last to the punch a lot of the time. So Collins was ahead on the scorecards going into round 8. And in the 8th round, Collins would drop Eubank with a straight right hand to the body. Eubank protested this as a slip, but the knockdown was counted. Eubank was caught off balance with the shot, but at the end of the day, it was the punch that caused him to go down. This then provoked a lively end to the round, liveliest exchange of the fight to that point. But that round was a 10-8 to Steve Collins, and the Irishman had widened his lead. So in round 9, we saw a more urgent approach from Eubank than the prior rounds as he tried to bring back the deficit, but this was to no avail. But the 10th round is where things get interesting now. Eubank would score a knockdown as he dropped Steve Collins hard with a right hand at the very start of the round. So after Collins made the count, Eubank had the next 2 minutes and 40 odd seconds to go for the kill. And this is not to say that Collins was completely out of it after the knockdown, he still had his wits about him, but Eubank pretty much completely let Collins off the hook for the whole remainder of the round, not punching much at all and showboating and stuff, despite his corner urging him to go for it, and despite the fact that he likely needed a knockout because he was probably behind on the cards. So when the round finished, Eubank got a big slap to the face from his trainer Ronnie Davis for not attempting to get Collins out of there. So whether Eubank's behaviour in that round was because he was too tired to go for the stoppage or because he was too cocky, who really knows. But the main theory is that Chris Eubank had PTSD from giving Michael Watson brain damage back in '91, and this is why he was hesitant to go for the finish. Especially because this was Eubank's first time dropping his opponent in the latter rounds of a fight since that Michael Watson fight. Plus, this fight between Eubank and Collins was taking place a mere 3 weeks after the Nigel Benn vs Gerald McLennan fight. So with the McLennan incident being so fresh, perhaps this resurfaced Eubank's apprehension to do damage. But that aside, the two men fought a lively and competitive 11th round, both landing good shots. And the 12th and final round was another lively one, with the underdog in Collins fighting his heart out. The Irish crowd were indeed pleased with the championship rounds. They were better than a lot of the earlier rounds in the fight. And the fight did ultimately go the 12 round distance, And with the lead that Collins had built earlier on, the Irish faithful were very hopeful that Collins would get the nod on the cards. And when the cards were read, Collins would indeed win a unanimous decision, winning 114 to 112 on 2 of the cards and 117 to 113 on the other. The Celtic warrior Steve Collins had done it. He'd upset the odds and defeated the great Chris Eubank. He had taken Eubank's O and his WBO super middleweight title to become a 2-weight WBO world champion. A great feat indeed. So now that Steve Collins was the WBO super middleweight champion of the world, his first defence of the world title would be an immediate rematch with Chris Eubank just under half a year later, on the 9th of September 1995. However, this was not an immediate rematch on the part of Chris Eubank. Being as active as he was, Eubank had 2 fights in the between time. There was a lot of questions surrounding Eubank's future right after the loss to Collins in Mill Street in March, but he'd be back in the ring by May, taking on the Argentinian national champion Bruno Godoy at the King's Hall in Belfast. At this point in time, Eubank had his eyes set on a rematch of Collins in July, and all the talk from Eubank ahead of the Godoy fight was about him being more dialed in and basically not having any mercy on his opponent anymore. And in this fight, Godoy would be stopped in the end of round 1 due to cuts caused by punches. So round 1 stoppage win for Eubank. Now, the rematch with Steve Collins would not be next. So Eubank was back in the ring in July, but against Jose Barata Buena, in what was an eliminator for Steve Collins' WBO super middleweight title, a fight that was to take place in September. In this fight now, Eubank dropped Barata Buena twice within the first minute of the first round, thus gaining the stoppage win within that first minute. So that was 2 first round stoppages in a row from a driven Eubank who had his eyes set on Steve Collins for September 9th. He was talking about how he was a different fighter now in the post-fight interview, alongside his promoter Barry Hearn. However, that Barata Buena fight would be Eubank's last ever fight with Barry Hearn as his promoter. So Eubank vs Collins 2, or should we say Collins vs Eubank 2, was on for September 9th in Steve Collins' home country of Ireland again, but at the Park y Cueve in Cork this time around. And yes, this time the difference was that both Chris Eubank and Steve Collins had left Barry Hearn's Matchroom Boxing stable. So Eubank vs Collins 1 was a Barry Hearn show, and now Collins vs Eubank 2 was a Frank Warren promoted show. As well as leaving Barry Hearn, Steve Collins had also left trainer Freddie King, who wasn't there for the training camp for the first Eubank fight. Collins brought in Freddie Roach as his new trainer ahead of the rematch, and there was a good bit of tension in the build-up to Collins vs Eubank 2. Eubank continued to hype himself up as a changed fighter and continued to go on about Steve Collins' hypnosis for the first fight, accusing Collins of cheating in the first fight, but this time it was going to be different according to Eubank. But Collins was very confident ahead of the rematch and his first defence of the super middleweight world title. He believed that Eubank was focused on the wrong things ahead of this fight, and all of Eubank's talk only made Collins more determined to defeat Eubank again. But let's take a look at the fight now. So round 1, Steve Collins started out at an absolutely frenetic pace to create a wild, rough and tumble start to the fight. And he'd keep the pace up. Nothing pretty, bit of a messy affair, but it could be identified from the first round that the agenda was to outwork Eubank again in this rematch. A similarly wild start to the second as Collins literally charged at Eubank and he continued to throw way more punches than Eubank did, and the same in round 3 with Collins landing a bunch of good shots. He didn't have the power to hurt Eubank, but it's fair to say that he was scoring more points. Another fast start to the 4th from Collins. Eubank was staying poised trying to pick his shots, but Collins would just not let him for the most part. He kept the pressure on, and the same in the 5th. Collins still just swarming Eubank and Eubank couldn't keep up with the pace. Collins didn't quite keep the same pace in the 6th round, but he was still outworking Eubank by far. And same in the 7th. Not quite the same pace as the first 5 rounds, but Collins was outdogging Eubank. But Collins was cut from a clash of heads when Eubank lunged in to throw a couple of body shots late in the 7th, and then Eubank landed a couple of decent shots at the end of the round. So although the cut was from a head clash, with Collins having such a deep cut above the eye, and Eubank having a fairly strong end to the round, could the fight start to trend in a different direction from round 8? And would Collins start to fade after keeping such a high pace for so long? So Eubank did try to keep up with the pace of Steve Collins early in the 8th to some decent success. The same pace wasn't quite kept up until the end of the round, but the two men went back and forth with decent punches throughout. And by the way, the bleeding above Collins' eye was looking bad coming out of the 8th round, and the doctors did have a good look at that cut, but the fight would go on. Collins then continued to completely outwork and outdog Eubank, being first and last to the punch for the most part of the 9th and 10th, but Eubank was still game, landing good single shots here and there and had a decent end to the 10th. Eubank picked up on that good end to the 10th, landing some more good right hands in the 11th. Before the 12th and final round now, Eubank's trainer Ronnie Davis told him that he needed a knockout, and Eubank would go for it in the final round, but Collins was still just too gritty and kept his pace up in that last round, which made for an exciting 12th and final round for the noisy court crowd to enjoy. So the fight of course went the distance, and surely Collins had got the win again, by a wide gap this time. Eubank looked dangerous later on, but Collins outworked him big time for most of the fight, and looked as if he landed a much bigger volume of punches. The Irish crowd were sure of a Collins win again, that's for sure. But now, here's what the official cards read.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a split decision. Genaro Hernandez scores the contest 114-115 in favour of Chris Eubank. Alan Kaiser scores the contest 113-115 in favour of Steve Collins. Paul Herman scores the contest 113-115 in favour of the winner, and still
Steve Collins has got it! Steve Collins has got it! But those judges had it, I must say, a good deal close.
Yes, one judge had given the fight to Eubank, and the two judges that gave it to Collins only gave it him 7-5. But all that mattered is that he had got the win over Eubank again, and he was still the champ. He ended Chris Eubank's long title reign and handed him his first defeat, then defeated him again in the immediate rematch to end the Chris Eubank vs Steve Collins saga at 2-0 to Steve Collins. The new version of Chris Eubank in the rematch was not enough for the Celtic Warrior. And may I add, although the first fight had a lot more story to it, there was a lot more drama in the ring with both men knocking each other down, and it was the big upset, I would opine that the second fight was a lot more consistently entertaining throughout the rounds. Neither of the two fights were crazy good fights to be quite honest, but I personally enjoyed the second one more. So what was next for Steve Collins after his first defence of the WBO super middleweight title in the Eubank rematch? Well, he'd be back in the ring by November, defending his title against Cornelius Carr in Dublin. Collins won this one by unanimous decision to keep his belt. Then for his third defence of the title, moving on to 1996, he'd be back in Mill Street against Neville Brown in March, and Collins would get the 11th round stoppage win in that one. And then title defence number 4 would be against none other than Chris Eubank's greatest rival, Nigel Benn, in July. Collins was to be defending his title against Benn at the 9X Arena in Manchester. All of Collins' last 4 fights to that point were in Ireland, but he was now back in England, the country where he won his WBO middleweight title off of Chris Pyatt. Now, Nigel Benn's last fight to this point, before being set to challenge Steve Collins for his WBO super middleweight title, he lost his WBC super middleweight title to Sugarboy Malinga back in March to end his 3.5-year reign with that belt. And after losing that fight, Nigel Benn would famously give an emotional retirement speech. He said that he was done with boxing, but just when he thought he was out, they pulled him back in, and he was back in there to fight Steve Collins just 4 months later. Well, Nigel Benn revealed that he changed his mind about retiring just a few hours after giving that post-fight speech after the Malinga fight. However, Benn was heavily contemplating retirement a couple fights before the Malinga fight, so clearly retirement is something that Nigel Benn was very indecisive about at this point. Always kinda had his foot out the door but didn't really want to call it quits. Now as for the build up for Steve Collins versus Nigel Benn, there wasn't really any aggro, just a bit of light-hearted controversy about Nigel Benn no-showing or showing up late for the press conferences. But let's have a look at the fight now. In the opening round, both men looked eager to attack, throwing some big shots and looking to brawl, but they were meeting in the clinch a good few times, and Collins probably just got the better of that first round. Similar in round 2, a messy affair as both men keep tying up while going in for big power shots in close. The second round looked like a Benn round though, so this was a competitive fight. In the first minute of the third now, Nigel Benn was going hard, landing some big power shots, much to the delight of the English crowd. But Collins started to land better shots for most of the rest of the round. But Benn did get a couple more big shots in later on, so round 3 was a nice competitive back and forth round. Round 4 things were still competitive and back and forth, and the crowd were making noise for Benn's big swings, and some of these shots were landing, so some chin on Steve Collins to take those shots by the way. But with just over a minute to go in the fourth, Benn would throw a wild overhand right that caused him to slip over and hurt his right ankle. Benn was limping when he got up, but he did opt to continue with the compromised ankle. Nigel Benn boxed on for another 30 odd seconds but then turned his back and quit due to the pain of his ankle. Steve Collins was then the winner by TKO. He had just become the only man to defeat both of the two legendary British boxing rivals in Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn. The Irishman stood triumphant in Manchester and he was still the WBO super middleweight champion of the world, now boasting 4 title defences. But of course, that was a very anticlimactic end to a fight that was brewing up to be a good brawl and war of attrition. A 4th round stoppage win for Collins, but it was because Nigel Benn had to quit due to his ankle injury at the time that the fight was very competitive. But the overall consensus was that Nigel Benn just didn't have it in him anymore. Perhaps the Nigel Benn of old would have fought on through that bit of ankle pain. And in the post-fight interview, he was saying that this was it for him now and that his fiancée wants him to retire. But hold your horses, Mrs. Benn did not have the final say. That wasn't it for Nigel Benn. He wasn't retired just yet. The unsatisfactory end to the first Steve Collins fight would warrant an immediate rematch. Steve Collins and Nigel Benn were set to go at it again just 4 months later, on November 9th. So I guess Benn had made a recovery from the ankle injury. Steve Collins vs Nigel Benn 2 was set to be in the same location as the first fight, at the 9X Arena in Manchester. So hopefully the Manchester crowd could get a better spectacle this time around. And this Collins vs Benn 2 fight had a stacked undercard, with Winky Wright defending his WBO junior middleweight title and Naseem Hamed defending his WBO featherweight title. And you had other names on the card like Herbie Hyde and Carl Thompson. But some of you might recognise the date November 9th, 1996 and realise that Collins vs Benn 2 was actually not the biggest fight taking place that night at all. As later that night, over in the States, you had the WBA heavyweight title fight between Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield taking place. Stacked undercard on that one as well, with Henry Akinwande defending his WBO heavyweight title and Michael Moore defending his IBF heavyweight title. So massive night of boxing all round. Now, the Jumbotron for the Collins vs Benn fight was actually devoted to displaying the number to call and purchase the Tyson Holyfield pay-per-view. But of course, the focus today is Steve Collins and Nigel Benn, so let's take a look at this fight now between the two foes that were ready and raring to go at each other. Could Nigel Benn prove that he still had what it takes in this world title fight rematch after quitting in the first fight? Oh, and by the way, quickly before we take a look at this fight, Nigel Benn had bet $100,000 on himself ahead of this rematch. The Manchester crowd were well behind Nigel Benn and were raucous as the fight started. This was a very tense opening round with both men missing a lot of big power shots and meeting in clinches, reminiscent of the opening round of the first fight. So there was hope that things could pick up on the part of both men. Still the same type of fight in round 2, but Collins was now getting through with more clean shots, dominating the first couple minutes of the round. But Nigel Benn landed 2 big left hooks later in the round that got the crowd really hyped up, but Collins did take them on the chin just fine. Referee has a word of both of them about leading in with the head at the start of round 3, and round 3 was a round that was scrappy and rough and tumble all throughout. Benn was very much getting the better of this rough and tumble stuff here, landing some good shots in close, and later in the round, Benn did move Collins a bit with some big shots to the chin, but Collins took them well again and kept on coming. So very competitive fight this. The third was definitely a Nigel Benn round, but he was probably 2-1 down at that point. Round 4 was another scrappy but fun one with both men fighting for position to land big shots in close, but those big clean shots were mainly coming from Steve Collins in this round. And later in the round, Benn began to look dishevelled, not throwing too much back. Now, despite the latter stages of the fourth being the first sign of any real fatigue from Nigel Benn, his trainer Kevin Sanders threatened to pull him out of the fight if he didn't pick things up in the next round. His corner didn't want to see him beaten down anymore. At face value of the fight, this reaction to the fourth round does seem rather dramatic from Benn's corner, but this clearly had something to do with the lack of motivation that Benn had for boxing in general at this point in his life. So could Benn pick things up in the fifth? Well, Steve Collins was tagging Benn with clean shots in there. Benn would throw back here and there, but the story here was that Collins was continuously beating Benn to the punch. Just over halfway through round 5 now, Steve Collins was deducted a point for leading in with the head. So could this point deduction for Collins provide a lifeline for Nigel Benn, give him some urgency to capitalise on the point? Well, Collins would be tagging Benn with clean shots the second that the round resumed. He was landing right hands at will. The English crowd tried to urge Benn on, but the punches from his part were becoming fewer and further between. So let's see if Benn's corner followed through on their threat to pull their man out. Well, Nigel Benn would say to his trainer, "Give me one more." So Benn did enter the 6th round. Benn was going for it early in the 6th round, and he would get through with a couple of clean shots, but they didn't really affect the tough Irishman, and Collins would continue to outland him for the rest of the round. Collins had been investing to the body here and there in this fight, but he was honing in on the body a good bit more towards the end of the 6th, and Benn looked really tired in there. He gallantly went for some haymakers, but he just looked knackered. So the bell rang for the end of the 6th round, and the second Benn went back to his corner after the 6th round, his team called the fight off, and the crowd were really not pleased, I must say. So a corner retirement to end the fight, meaning that Steve Collins was the winner by stoppage and was still the WBO super middleweight champion of the world. So that was the second consecutive stoppage winner over Nigel Benn for the Celtic Warrior Steve Collins in what was title defence number 5. The man had beaten Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn twice each now, a truly historical achievement, holding 2 wins over the 2 great rivals who had 2 legendary fights with each other that revolutionised the whole of British boxing. The Irishman reigned supreme over the 2 British boxing megastars of the 90s, and he had the beating of both warriors through true grit, a solid chin, and a great work rate. Now, right after Steve Collins vs Nigel Benn 2, Benn would conduct yet another post-fight retirement speech, but this time it was really it. Despite Benn contemplating retirement a good while before ever fighting Steve Collins, the 2 Collins fights would be enough to urge Nigel Benn to call it a day for good. As for Steve Collins himself, after the Nigel Benn rematch, he would defend his WBO super middleweight title twice more, having his last ever fight in 1997, and retiring as a world champion with 7 title defences and 9 consecutive world title fight victories. So with the whole history of the Benn vs Eubank rivalry being rekindled ahead of Conor Benn vs Chris Eubank Jr. this Saturday, I thought I would take a look back at what is an overlooked chapter to the Benn Eubank saga, that being both men's 2 fights against the Celtic Warrior Steve Collins. Thus far in this series, I have looked back at many elements of the Eubank-Benn rivalry, and I have celebrated Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank's respective legendary careers and their legendary rivalry with each other. So I don't bring up their losses to Steve Collins to dampen the hype around the Eubank and Benn legacies, but I do this to remind people that there was a greatly underappreciated Irishman who beat both men twice. The reason that the 4 fights, or at least 3 of the 4 fights that I looked at today, are widely overlooked, that excluding Eubank vs Collins 1, which is quite a popular fight, is because there is a narrative out there from a large constituent of boxing fans that Steve Collins is this guy who just came along and beat both Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn when they were both past their best. And they theorised that Steve Collins wouldn't have had a chance against either men in their primes. So a lot of people will therefore just focus on Benn and Eubank's fights with each other, maybe both men's fights with Michael Watson, Benn's fight with Gerald McLennan, and other fights that both Benn and Eubank won when looking back at their careers. And many of these people seem comfortable leaving Collins out of the conversation despite him beating both men twice each, again due to the "they were past their primes at that point" narrative. As I mentioned earlier, Steve Collins took Chris Eubank's O and ended his title reign in their first fight, after 14 consecutive title defences on Eubank's part, and Eubank was coming off one of his best defences of his belt and one of his better career performances against Henry Wharton. Also, when it comes to the discussion of Eubank being over the hill, Chris Eubank was actually younger than Steve Collins and was only 28 years old going into that first fight. But this Eubank vs Collins 1 fight could get overshadowed due to a bunch of things, mainly Eubank letting Collins off the hook in the 10th round after knocking him down. People use this moment to get into the discussion of Chris Eubank's diminished finishing instincts that go back to the Michael Watson fight. But at the end of the day, that was 1 round of the fight. Collins outworked Eubank and got the better of most of the rounds of the fight, and there is no guarantee that Eubank would have stopped him in that 10th round if he did go for it. Plus, Eubank might have just been too tired to go for it anyway. And as for Collins vs Eubank 2, there's no taking that win away from Steve Collins. As I said, it was meant to be a better and more dialed in version of Eubank going into that rematch, but Collins then outworked him to an even greater extent than he did in fight 1. Eubank has later gone on to comment that Collins' eager and frenetic start to that rematch really threw him off. That's what really gave Collins the mental edge. And one could say that Eubank never truly got into the fight properly until the later rounds because of that fast start. So credit should go to Collins for pushing that pace on Eubank early and creating such a good lead in that rematch. And as for what Eubank did after the 2 Steve Collins fights, yes, he didn't achieve anything else after fighting Collins, and he went 2-3 for the rest of his career. But his 2 losses against Carl Thompson were great losing efforts to say the least. Now, the claims of Nigel Benn being past his best when Collins fought him do hold some validity. Definitely more valid than the claims of Eubank being past his best when Collins fought him. Nigel Benn was flirting with retirement at that point, as aforementioned, and both of his fights with Collins had unsatisfactory ends. Quitting due to an ankle injury that we're unsure of the severity of, and it was likely a pain that Nigel Benn would have once fought through, and then being pulled out by his overly cautious corner in the rematch. But look, Nigel Benn was the same age as Steve Collins, and was 32 years old in both of his fights against Collins. And while the action lasted in both of those fights, Nigel Benn was boxing fairly well. Collins was getting the better of things and Nigel Benn was seemingly less active and less determined than he once was, but physically, he did look like the same Nigel Benn, with the moves he was able to pull off. And Steve Collins versus Nigel Benn 1 was not even a year and a half removed from Nigel Benn versus Gerald McLennan, a fight that many consider to be Nigel Benn's best career performance. So the 2 wins over Benn were valid title defences for Steve Collins. Of course, Nigel Benn did retire right after the 2 Collins fights, which adds validity to the claims that he was a shot fighter, but the fact is that Benn was performing pretty decent until both of the 2 fight stoppages, and if those fights weren't to be stopped due to Benn's injuries or lack of desire or whatever, and Nigel Benn managed to keep up the same pace that he was fighting in those early rounds until the end of the fight, in theory, Steve Collins would have probably beat him on points both times out, just like he did Eubank. Oh, and much like with the Chris Eubank rematch, we were supposedly getting a better version of Nigel Benn in his second fight with Steve. So, I do think that Steve Collins was really just a nightmare matchup for both Eubank and Benn. Collins didn't have a lot of power and didn't have the prettiest style, but again, he had a great chin, a great work rate, and he was a good boxer as well, of course. It wasn't just work rate, he had to time his entries of attack well and all of that stuff to complement his work rate. Eubank had struggled with good boxers at times throughout his 18 world title fights prior to the Collins fights, and was on the fortunate end of a couple of controversial decisions in a couple of those fights. But the activity of Steve Collins was something different from anything that any of Eubank's previous challengers had posed. And now going back to Nigel Benn versus Gerald McLennan, yes, Gerald McLennan was a way more dangerous puncher than Steve Collins was, and he threw the kitchen sink at Nigel Benn in the first round. But as I've mentioned a couple of times in my recent videos, Gerald McLennan was going for big, powerful, single shots for the most part after the first round against Benn. But Collins' activity was constant against Benn, through many combinations in unorthodox fashion. So who's to say that the version of Nigel Benn who beat Gerald McLennan didn't lose to Steve Collins by a clear decision on the cards? And even if we are to call both Benn and Eubank over the hill when Collins fought them both, at the end of the day, Steve Collins fought them when he had the chance to. Collins was fighting in America and across Europe a bit back when Chris Eubank was having all of the glory in England. And Collins didn't get the chance to challenge Nigel Benn for either of the belts that he held in his 2 world title reigns. When Collins started to fight exclusively in the UK in 1993 to see if he can get in that Eubank and Benn mix, it took him 2 years and an extraordinary circumstance with the cancellation of Chris Eubank vs Ray Close 3 to get his crack at Eubank in 95. So even if you could make a case for the fact that Steve Collins was only a bad matchup for those more worn out versions of Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn that had so many miles on the clock, and that the version of Nigel Benn that beat Doug DeWitt and Iran Barkley and the version of Chris Eubank that beat Nigel Benn would have had the battering of the version of Steve Collins that lost to Mike McCallum, at the end of the day, he fought Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn twice each when he was in position to fight them, and he beat them both fair and square twice each. Now, we could go on all day about the past their prime stuff, how much desire Eubank and Benn really had at the point of the Steve Collins fights. And there's a lot of other conversations to be had as well when it comes to Steve Collins' resume and legacy all round. Some would give Steve Collins the credit and say that Roy Jones Jr. ducked Steve Collins for years, but on the other hand, some would say that Steve Collins retired early to duck Joe Calzaghe. And I've referred to Steve Collins as a world champion throughout this video, but he was of course exclusively a WBO world champion back in the 90s, but that's also the only belt that Eubank held, both men having held the WBO middleweight and super middleweight titles. So the ducking conversations and the WBO conversations is all talk for another day. The focus today was the 4 legendary wins that the Celtic Warrior Steve Collins holds over 2 British boxing legends, wins that he should be heralded for. So this video has of course been a part of my series in which I talk all things Eubank and Benn, and today, for any of you who hadn't heard much about Steve Collins, or maybe you just merely knew him as the guy who did the whole hypnotism hoax against Chris Eubank and beat Eubank and Benn when they were past their bests, I hope you have learned something new about Steve Collins' rivalries with both Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn today. and it is fight week now, so Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn is really edging closer. So ahead of Saturday, please do check out my previous videos in this series, all of which will be linked in the description. So have a look at the deeper, darker and more obscure elements of the Eubank and Benn lore. There is decent promotional content being produced in the mainstream, but all of that will get repetitive as there are just certain things that they won't get into. That's not me saying that I'm trying to be this edgy guy talking about all of the dark stuff. There's also a lot of interesting trivia that the mainstream outlets wouldn't bother covering in promotion of this fight. Not that they're obliged to, but yeah, some of the promo packages on DAZN and stuff can get a tad repetitive and a little bit generic. And all of that stuff trying to promote that Fatal Fury game is a load of malarkey. So again, please check out my previous content if you are interested in some of that good old boxing trivia. Do leave your thoughts about this video in the comments down below. I do hope you have all enjoyed my piece on Steve Collins today. Thank you for making it to this point in the video, and you have been listening to O.M.E. Boxing.